So good morning, church. It's good to be with you again this week to share a message with you and to help you have a time of worship at home. And I'm hoping that, again, that your time of worship is meaningful for you, and that even though we're not together, that you know and can feel everyone's presence with you as you worship from home. So we continue our quarantine time, and our bishop has asked us to not meet in person and to continue to wait for his word on that, and so that's what we'll be doing. Just a reminder once again to read your newsletter so that information that you need is in there, along with your resource for Sunday morning worship at home. If you need anything, please call the office. We answer the phone every day, and even though we're not physically in the office, but Mondays and Thursdays for half a day, we still can take your calls. We still can provide assistance in however it is that you might need it. And so please don't hesitate to let me know through the office what it is that we can do for you during this time. Please continue to reach out to one another. Don't let yourself be so isolated that you feel lost and alone, because we're all in this same boat and we can certainly get through this together. So please know that it's very important for us to remain connected even while we're apart. Also, just as a reminder, there's music interludes that will be spaced in between the message and scripture reading, so I hope those are meaningful for you also. Our scripture lesson this morning comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, from chapter 10, and I'll be reading verses 46 through 52. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to Jesus, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day. our scripture lesson this morning is one of my favorites. I think it's a wonderful story because it's a story of great faith. A story of a blind man who was forced to beg because of his disability. That's really all people in his situation could do. And somewhere along the way, he is able to hear that there's a crowd and has discerned that Jesus is with the crowd and begins to call out loudly to him, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And as the scripture says, his friends were annoyed with him, telling him to shush and be quiet. And he even calls out even louder after they shush him. And Jesus hears him somehow over the crowd. And Jesus calls to him and says, let him know to come to me. And so we know that Bartimaeus throws off his cloak, goes to where Jesus is, and then Jesus asks that question that he has asked others before. He says, what do you want me to do for you? And Bartimaeus says, I want to see again. So it appears that as soon as he says these words, that Jesus does exactly that, heals him and gives him his sight. And immediately, it says in the scripture, he left, and instead of going off and telling everyone of his good fortune, he goes and follows Jesus. Again, a great story. This is a great story on many levels. One of them is that it's a story of someone getting their sight back, and you can imagine how exciting that must be. Because Bartimaeus is one of those who had known what sight was, had that gift, and had lost it. And to have that restored, to be renewed, must have been such a wonderful, wonderful thing. It's also a story about faith and about advocating for oneself. And it's a story about not letting other people hush your voice when you have something important to do. So Bartimaeus was a man of great faith. In fact, Jesus says to him, your faith has made you well. I think a lot of us maybe can relate to a little bit, at least, to Bartimaeus. I'm not blind, but I don't see very well without my glasses. And a lot of people have corrective surgeries done on their eyes so that they can see more clearly. Losing one's sight is very traumatic, and we do all we can to have good eyesight because we want to see things clearly. Now, in the scriptures, if you look back a ways, you'll read that Jesus has already done healing in his ministry. And in fact, this story takes place kind of towards the end of Jesus' ministry. And so he's done other miracles. And perhaps as Bartimaeus has sat there, letting people go by him, begging for whatever they will give him, he certainly has good hearing. And he's probably heard stories of people talking about this Jesus of Galilee, and his healing others. And in Scripture it tells us that Bartimaeus is not the first that he's healed with a return of sight. And so there is Bartimaeus. He hears a crowd coming and is able in some way to discern that Jesus is among the crowd that day. And he knows that Jesus is a healer because he's heard that too. And so he doesn't let this opportunity, this chance, to miss out on perhaps being healed himself. Now, I also need to say that we all should recognize by now, hopefully in our faith journey, that the stories that we hear of Jesus are not just about the actual thing that happened, but they have underlying meanings. They have greater depth of meaning than what is just at the surface. And this is another one of those instances where there's a deeper meaning trying to be given out to us, the hearers of this story. That it isn't just about the sight that we have just to be able to see things, but it's about a much deeper kind of seeing, a kind of seeing that helps us learn and be better disciples and better people. So Jesus in his ministry with his disciples has spent a lot of time trying to help the disciples to see things. And not just see things, but to see deeper things, deeper meaning in the words that he says. And as I said, this is towards the end of Jesus' time on earth, and he knows that that's coming. And so if you look back in Scripture, you'll see that when they were together in Philippi, he tells the disciples, at Caesarea Philippi, I should say, he tells the disciples, the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the religious authorities and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And the response that comes from Peter is that he rebukes Jesus and tells him, don't talk like that. He doesn't understand. He doesn't see. And then another story, they're passing through Galilee, and Jesus tells the disciples again that the Son of Man will be betrayed and killed and will rise from the dead. And in Gospel of Mark, the disciples did not understand, and they were even afraid, it says in Scripture, to ask him what he meant. Because they too, at that time, again, couldn't see. And yet again, they're going up to Jerusalem, where he will be betrayed and killed. And Jesus tries one last time to show the disciples what is about to happen, to tell them again how things will go. And he says that the Son of Man will be handed over. He will be killed, and he will rise from the dead. And it's really an odd response that comes to us from the brothers James and John, because they're having an argument about who should sit at his right hand and who should sit at his left hand when Jesus comes into his glory. And you could almost see Jesus sigh, maybe even roll his eyes, because James and John still don't see. Now, it's easy for us to criticize the disciples for their inability to see, to grasp the things that Jesus is showing them. But we really need to be considering what it is that's happening. You know, the things that Jesus is showing them are not easy to see. Jesus is asking them to see suffering and betrayal and death. And not just any suffering, betrayal, and death, but his suffering, betrayal, and death. So we have to ask ourselves, what might that do to us if our beloved teacher, our rabbi, told us these things about himself or herself? Because some of these things are just too hard to grasp. And maybe there's some things in our minds that we think are better just left alone. If I don't talk about it, it won't be. Because sometimes that deep seeing that we must do is hard. And that's especially true in our lives of faith. It's much easier to focus on the happy parts of our faith, the part of our faith that brings us the greatest joy, because we know God's with us and we feel God's surrounding us and our well-being is at our hearts, and we find hope in God. And so our faith, and when we see our faith, we see it as something that's wonderful and happy and joyous. But faith really isn't just about the happy parts. If we have a mature faith, we know that faith calls us also to engage in the hard things like suffering and betrayal and death. And in our lives today, it calls us to see the hard things like poverty, human trafficking, corporate corruption, climate change, hunger, domestic violence, and all of those things that are a part of our life, that indeed are a part of our faith. So while our faith might want to look only on the happy parts of life, a mature faith dares to look at the hard parts too. But when we really see, especially when we see the hard parts, it exacts a price from us. Because when we truly see the world, we see its brokenness, and we lose our innocence. And we see just how much suffering there is in the world, and we see how much brokenness there is in the world. And when we see this brokenness, though, we should hopefully feel compelled to change what we do and to make change happen. There's an author whose name is Nora Gallagher, and she puts it this way. She says, I remember thinking as I worked in the soup kitchen that I did not want to know what I was learning, because then my life couldn't go on in the same way as it had before, driving around in my nice red Volvo, thinking about what new linens to buy. She says we can't unlearn what we learn. We cannot see what we see. So, while it's easy to criticize Jesus' disciples for not seeing the truth that he's trying to tell them, maybe their not seeing was just a protective kind of defense mechanism that they had put in their lives. Because maybe deep down they knew that once they really saw what Jesus was showing to them, they would not be able to unsee it. And maybe deep down they knew that once they saw what he was saying about the reality of the world, their lives were going to have to change. And maybe deep down they knew that once they saw that following Jesus would lead their lives into suffering and betrayal and death perhaps, they didn't want to see that. And maybe the disciples avoided seeing what Jesus was showing them because deep down they knew that when you really see, it can be dangerous. Consider this story of a photojournalist whose name was Kevin Carter. In 1993, he was covering the famine in Sudan, and he took a picture of a small girl who had collapsed while walking to a food station. And in the picture, just a few feet behind the starving girl, a vulture stalking her. On May of 1994, just a little bit after that, a year later, Carter won a Pulitzer Prize for that photograph. And 2 months later, he committed suicide. A close friend of Carter's said that after the shooting of the photo of the starving girl, that Kevin went and sat under a tree and cried and chain smoked. He could not distance himself from the horror of what he had seen. He could not unsee what he had seen. So you see, it's dangerous sometimes to see. I guess seeing can call into question everything that we've believed. It can dismantle our faith even perhaps, or our theology, or even our worldview. Truly seeing can devastate us. And yet truly seeing is the big part of who we are as followers of Jesus Christ, because we are called to see things as they really are. Why else would Jesus show his disciples, not once, not twice, but 3 times, what was going to happen to him when he got to Jerusalem? Seeing must be important to the life of faith. But if seeing is important to the life of faith and also has the potential to devastate us, what do we do? Do we keep our hearts open and our eyes closed? Or do we keep our eyes open and our hearts closed? Is there some way that we as people of faith can keep our eyes and our hearts open? What I'm asking is, how do we survive really seeing? Well, we have Bartimaeus as an example. He started by focusing on Jesus. Jesus, he said, "Son of David, have mercy on me." So first, Bartimaeus acknowledges Jesus. And in that moment, because of his faith, his sight is restored. So the first thing that Bartimaeus does is he trusts Jesus, and then he sees. And before Bartimaeus looks at anything, sees anything, Jesus becomes the context for everything else he will see. After his healing, Bartimaeus won't see anything without thinking first of the person who restored his sight, Jesus. And before that first ray of light hits that first molecule of his retina, Jesus becomes the context in which Bartimaeus, from then on, will see everything. So what does it mean to see everything in the context of Jesus? Well, I think it means that we look at the world and we will see suffering, that we'll see betrayal, that we'll see death, and that we'll know that seeing these things is unavoidable because we live in a broken place. And a mature faith needs to see those places. And in those broken places, when we see them, we see Jesus. But we know when Jesus shows the disciples time and time again, when you look at the world, even at its ugliest and hardest and most fragile places, you still need to see it in the context of Jesus. Because when you do that, you will see restoration and resurrection right along with it. And so when we look at the things in the world that are hard, that are ugly, eventually, if we truly see, and we see in the context of Jesus, we see restoration and resurrection and even hope. So how do people of faith survive truly seeing? We follow the example of Bartimaeus and begin with Jesus. And if we believe that God's love extends to the whole world, to every person and to every situation, if we believe that God is everywhere present, working in all creation for its redemption, then we need to ask God, please God, help us see. And we need to ask God to help us see with open eyes and open hearts so that we can truly see the brokenness of the world and the place in it that is ours, while all along also seeing the restoration, the resurrection, and the hope.